You know, when you stand in front of a really magnificent ancient piece of architecture, there's this, I don't know, this overwhelming tendency to just look at the grand, sweeping lines.
Oh, totally. Yeah, you just see the big picture.
Right. You see the cedar beams, the gold inlay, the sheer, just immovable weight of the stone foundation.
It looks so permanent.
Exactly. It looks permanent, inevitable almost. But then, you step a little closer.
Right.
And you run your hand along the masonry and you notice this hairline fracture running right up from the bedrock.
Yeah, that sinking feeling.
Yes. You realize that this entire structure, despite all its glory, despite the fact that everyone is, still feasting in the dining hall, it's actually tearing itself apart from the inside.
It's failing structurally.
It is. And today, we are looking at the fractures in the foundation of Israel's greatest dynasty. So, welcome to the second half of our deep dive into the source material of 2 Samuel.
Specifically, we're looking at chapters 11 through 24 today.
Right. And I will just say right at the top, for everyone listening, this is the darkest, most psychologically complex, and honestly most devastating territory we have covered in this entire project.
It really is. I mean, it's a profound structural failure that's just masked by this beautiful facade.
Yeah.
We're moving from the triumphant ascendance of a king who, seemingly could do no wrong, right, into a world of crisis, of just profound grief and, total political disintegration.
Absolute chaos.
Exactly. And because this material is so incredibly dense, and because we know those of you listening have likely spent years, engaging with biblical scholarship and LDS theology, we are going to take our time today.
We're not rushing this.
No, we aren't going to rush the complexities at all.
Right. So here's how we're going to navigate this over the next hour or so. First, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to start with a pure narrative and historical overview.
Just setting the stage.
Yeah, we want to immerse you in the physical and political world of the late 10th century BCE before we really start analyzing it.
Give you the lay of the land.
Exactly. From there, we'll briefly set up our scholarly framework, specifically looking at the succession narrative and what academics actually think this text is trying to accomplish.
Right. The why of the text.
Yeah. And after that, we just dive into the deep end. We will unpack David's catastrophic moral failure with Bathsheba and, of course, the murder of Uriah.
Which is just a masterclass in narrative tension.
Oh, it really is. We'll focus heavily on the brilliant narratological strategies the author uses to essentially trap the reader in that horror.
And then, we have to confront the massive theological headache this creates for the broader Deuteronomistic history.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, how do you reconcile this idealized perfect king with a documented murderer? It's a huge problem.
It's the central problem.
Right. So we'll look at that, and then we'll look at Absalom's rebellion, treating it as a masterpiece of political history. And we'll examine the just astonishing candor the text uses to describe David's grief.
It's so raw.
It really is. And we'll also tackle those closing appendices, including that deeply troubling census narrative.
Right, chapter 24.
Yeah. And finally, we will conclude with an explicit shift into an LDS devotional reflection, focusing on the Come Follow Me themes for the week.
Perfect. Okay, let's start by putting all the scholarly apparatus aside for just a few minutes. Let's just step into the world of the text.
I love this part.
Right. So paint the picture of this world at its absolute peak, right before the fracture appears. We're in the late 10th century BCE. What does the map actually look like?
Okay, so it is a world that has been entirely reshaped by, frankly, one man's sheer tactical genius and charisma. David, yeah. He has reigned over a united Israel for perhaps, 15 or 20 years at this point.
So he's well established.
Very. And the empire he has built, and honestly, empire might not even be the right word for this.
Right, it's more of a network, isn't it?
Yep. Exactly. It's this loose, hegemonic network of alliances and vassal states. But it stretches all the way from the Lebanese highlands up in the north, right down through the harsh, arid Negev and across the Transjordan.
Wow.
This is it. This is the absolute zenith of Israelite power.
And right at the center of all that power is Jerusalem.
Yes.
Yeah.
Jerusalem. It sits high up on this limestone ridge, and it's balanced perfectly between the older, perpetually warring tribal territories of Benjamin and Judah.
Which was incredibly strategic.
Oh, it was a masterstroke. David conquered it precisely because it belonged to neither tribe. It is a neutral political capital that binds a deeply divided land together.
like Washington, D.C. not being in any specific state.
That's a perfect analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
And the Ark of the Covenant, the very throne of Yahweh, is finally there, resting in a tent.
Right.
The palace, which is built of this imported Tyrian cedar, it just dominates the skyline.
Yeah.
And honestly, everything David touches at this point seems to turn to gold.
I mean, the brutal, desperate survival wars of his youth, the ones where he's out hiding from Saul in caves, those are completely in the rearview mirror.
Oh, long gone.
The Philistines, who were, the great existential threat of that prior era, they've been permanently contained.
They aren't raiding the highlands anymore.
Right. And the Ammonites to the east, the Arameans of Damascus to the north, Moab and Edom to the southeast, they're all subdued.
Yeah, they're paying heavy tribute.
Exactly. I mean, if you read 2 Samuel chapter 8, it reads like a victor's resume.
It really does. It's just a list of triumphs.
Right. It lists his brilliant commanders. It outlines this highly sophisticated, functioning bureaucratic apparatus, and the narrator just delivers this blunt, overarching verdict. The Lord preserved David whithersoever he went.
Which is just the peak. I mean, this is a man who has essentially consolidated the known world.
Yeah.
He is blessed beyond measure. He's commanding his empire from a cedar balcony. But he has reached that very dangerous point in a monarch's life.
Where the external enemies are gone.
Exactly. The external enemies are largely defeated, and the primary threats become internal.
Right. And that balcony is precisely where the turning point happens.
Yeah.
Chapter 11 opens with this quiet, almost suffocatingly ominous detail. It says, "It came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with David and all Israel. But David tarried still at Jerusalem."
It's so pointed.
It is. It's an afternoon. The text notes that David rises from his afternoon rest. He walks out on the roof of his palace. He looks down, and he sees a woman bathing.
And what follows is a cascade of catastrophe. It is perhaps the most compressed, devastating sequence in the entire Hebrew Bible.
It happens so fast.
So fast. He inquires about her. He
Yeah.
learns exactly who she is. Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite.
And that lineage, that identification is so important.
It's crucial. Uriah is a decorated soldier in David's own elite guard. He is currently out fighting the siege of Rabbah, which is the very war that David himself should be out leading.
Instead of being on his roof.
Right. But David sends messengers for her. She comes, he sleeps with her, she goes home, and a short time later she sends a message, "I am with child."
Wow.
In the space of barely 12 verses, the text establishes a total moral and institutional collapse.
And to me, the terrifying part is how methodical the cover-up is.
Yeah, it's chilling.
Because David doesn't panic and just immediately resort to murder. He resorts to statecraft. He uses the bureaucracy of his empire to hide his sin.
He really does.
He recalls Uriah from the front lines in Ammon under this guise of wanting a battlefield report from his general, Joab.
A completely manufactured excuse.
Exactly. The plan is brutally cynical. Get Uriah to come home, give him some royal favor, let him sleep with his wife, and, the pregnancy will be conveniently legally accounted for.
But Uriah is a soldier operating in strict campaign mode purity.
Right, the ancient rules of holy war.
Exactly. Those rules demanded sexual abstinence while a campaign was active, so Uriah flat out refuses to go down to his house.
He won't do it.
He refuses to sleep in a comfortable bed or be with his wife, while his commanding officer Joab, the Ark of the Covenant, and his fellow soldiers are sleeping in tents in the open field.
There is something so cutting about that detail.
It's an incredible contrast.
Uriah's rigid military honor functions as this blazing, almost unwitting indictment of his king. The loyal foreign vassal, the Hittite, is keeping the sacred rules of holy war that the Israelite king has cynically abandoned.
Yeah, it's devastating. And David tries to break that resolve, He gets Uriah drunk.
Which is just awful to picture.
It is. I always imagine this scene, the king pouring wine for his soldier, smiling, urging him to relax, while secretly, desperately needing him to break his vows to cover up a crime.
This is so dark.
But even drunk, Uriah refuses to break solidarity with his brothers in arms. He sleeps on a mat with the palace servants.
So the trap closes.
Yeah.
David writes a letter, and the cruelty of this moment is breathtaking. David writes the order for Uriah's execution, seals it, and hands it to Uriah himself to carry back to the front lines.
Uriah carries his own death warrant to Joab.
He carries his own death warrant. The order is explicit, too. Put Uriah in the front of the heaviest fighting, up against the city wall, and then have the troops pull back from him so that he is struck down and killed.
It's a localized betrayal. And Joab, who is ever the ruthless pragmatist, he just follows the order.
Right.
He sets Uriah at the wall where the enemy defenders are strongest. Uriah dies, along with several other Israelite soldiers, which is a key detail.
Collateral damage.
Exactly. And when the messenger returns to Jerusalem to deliver the news, Joab carefully frames the report so the king isn't blamed for what looks like a terrible tactical blunder.
And David's response is utterly cold.
No.
He tells the messenger to tell Joab basically, don't let this trouble you. The sword devours now one and now another. Press the attack.
The sword devours now one and now another.
It's the king brushing off the premeditated murder of his most loyal soldier as a mere inconvenience of war.
So Bathsheba mourns her husband, and when the customary mourning period is over, David brings her to the palace. She becomes his wife. The child is born. The cover-up appears entirely successful.
On the surface, he got away with it.
Right. But then the narrative overview concludes with one of the most economical, devastating sentences in all of literature. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord.
And that single sentence births the chaos that dominates the rest of his life. Everything unravels from there.
Oh, completely.
You have the prophet Nathan's confrontation. You have the death of the infant. You have David's firstborn son Amnon raping his half-sister Tamar.
The generational trauma begins.
Yeah. You have Absalom's calculated revenge, murdering Amnon, Absalom's full-scale rebellion, driving David out of his own capital barefoot and weeping.
Which is just a staggering reversal.
It is. Absalom desecrating David's concubines on the very same rooftop where this all began. The brutal battle in the forest. Absalom hanging from the oak tree by his hair, and Joab driving spears into his chest.
And finally, a broken, grieving king returning to a fractured, resentful kingdom.
It is a breathtaking tragedy.
Yeah.
But to truly understand what the text is doing with this history, let's explicitly shift gears here.
Right.
Away from the historical narrative and into the analytical framework.
Right, because we have to look at how this was actually put together.
Exactly. The central scholarly frame for these chapters revolves around something called the succession narrative. So I don't want us to get bogged down in a deep history of scholarship, but this is foundational. We aren't just reading a loose collection of court annals.
No, not at all. So going back to 1926, the German scholar Leonard Rost published a monograph that completely changed how we read this book.
Okay.
Working in the tradition of source criticism, Rost identified what he argued was an originally independent literary work running from Sisson 9 all the way through to 1 Kings 2. He called it the succession narrative.
And what was his main argument about it?
His argument was that this was a highly crafted, unified piece of literature organized around one central burning question: who will sit on David's throne after him?
And, I mean, it is universally recognized as some of the most sophisticated narrative prose to survive from the ancient Near East.
But unquestionable.
There's a psychological depth you just don't find in Egyptian or Assyrian royal records. You know, it shows you the mixed motives, the self-deception, the political calculations. But Ross thought this document was essentially Solomonic propaganda, right?
Yes, that was his view.
He thought it was written to justify why Solomon, who was a younger son, who absolutely shouldn't have inherited the throne, ultimately got it by showing how all his older brothers spectacularly disqualified themselves.
Yeah, that was Rost's thesis, and it held the field for a really long time. Later scholars, like P. Kyle McCarter, they complicated the boundaries of it.
Right.
And then John Van Seters and the Copenhagen School pushed back heavily. They argued that the later Deuteronomistic historian was actually a much more active, creative composer rather than just an editor pasting an older document into his history.
I have to say, I struggle with Rost's propaganda idea.
A lot of people do.
And this is where Walter Brueggemann's counter-reading makes so much more sense to me. Because Brueggemann asks this devastating question. If this is just a piece of apologetic propaganda for the Davidic dynasty, why on earth does it show the Davidic court as an absolute horror show?
It's a great question.
Right. Why portray the founder of your dynasty as a murderer and a failed father? Why show the court as a place of uncontrolled desire, rampant violence, and total institutional failure? That is terrible propaganda.
It really is, and it's the central tension we have to keep in mind for this whole discussion. Is this text a brilliant, albeit dark, piece of political justification, clearing the board of all rivals so Solomon looks inevitable?
Or is it something else entirely?
Exactly. Or is it a deeply subversive, prophetic critique of centralized monarchical power itself? Brueggemann argues that whoever wrote this wasn't flattering the king. They were telling a profoundly uncomfortable truth about what absolute power does to the human soul.
I love that. Let's take that tension and look specifically at how the text handles David's moral collapse in chapters 11 and 12. Because the genius of the writing here is actually in what the author refuses to tell us.
Yes, the narratological restraint is a theological argument.
Exactly. You are thinking of Robert Alter's analysis, right? In The Art of Biblical Narrative.
Yes. Alter points out that modern readers, we are conditioned by the novel. We expect paragraphs of a character's internal monologue.
We want to know what they're feeling.
Right. But biblical narrative is profoundly reticent. We almost never get the inner emotional states of these figures. The narrator gives us their actions, but rarely their feelings.
So with David and Bathsheba.
Right. We know David sent for Bathsheba. We don't know what he was feeling when he did it. Was it a momentary lapse of impulse? Was it a long simmering obsession? The text refuses to say.
And Bathsheba's interiority is famously entirely absent. I mean, in the Hebrew text, she speaks exactly 3 words in this entire sequence. I am with child.
That is it.
That's it. We don't know if she was a willing participant, if she felt trapped by royal coercion, or if she was a victim of outright assault by the most powerful man in the world.
Which brings us to Mayer Sternberg's work on the poetics of biblical narrative.
Okay, break that down.
Sternberg discusses how biblical writers use gaps, strategic, deliberate omissions of information, to implicate the reader.
Oh, that's fascinating.
The gaps around Bathsheba force you to do the ethical work.
Yeah.
If the text told you she was entirely innocent, you would pity her. If it told you she was seductive, you would judge her.
Right.
By letting that ambiguity sit unresolved, the text forces you to wrestle with the nature of power, consent, and complicity in a monarchical society.
I think that ambiguity is what makes it so haunting. But, the narrator isn't entirely silent about David's interiority.
True.
We do get that one terrifying glimpse into his psychology after the murder, when he tells the messenger, the sword devours now one and now another. He's not agonizing in guilt there.
No, not at all.
He has crossed the ultimate moral line, and he is just coldly, bureaucratically rationalizing his way forward. He thinks he has completely managed the crisis.
And that false sense of security is exactly what the prophet Nathan shatters in chapter 12.
Man, Nathan's confrontation is just a masterclass in rhetoric.
It really is.
He knows he can't just walk into the throne room and accuse an absolute monarch of murder. I mean, kings execute prophets for less.
All the time.
So he bypasses the king's defensive psychological walls entirely. He sets a parabolic trap. He comes to David not as a prophet bringing judgment, but seemingly as an advisor bringing a legal case for the king to adjudicate.
It's so brilliant.
It is. He tells a story about a rich man with massive flocks of sheep and a poor man who has nothing but one single ewe lamb. And Nathan adds this heartbreaking, deeply manipulative detail. The poor man raised this lamb as a daughter. It ate from his plate, drank from his cup.
And then a traveler arrives at the rich man's house, and instead of taking from his own vast herds to feed the guest, the rich man steals the poor man's single beloved lamb and slaughters it.
And David's reaction is explosive.
Yeah.
He operates entirely as the righteous chief justice of Israel here.
Yeah.
He says, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and had no pity.
And then Nathan drops the hammer.
Yeah.
4 words in English that just change biblical history. You are the man.
You are the man. It's incredible.
By using the parable, Nathan gets David to render an objective, unsparing legal judgment on his own behavior before his ego can put up a defense.
Right.
You see a very similar prophetic technique used later by Elijah against King Ahab regarding the theft of Naboth's vineyard. You isolate the king's conscience from his power.
Okay, so I want to explicitly signal a shift here. We're moving from the established scholarly literary analysis of the parable into a piece of interpretive synthesis regarding David's judgment.
Okay, the 4-fold restoration.
Yes, because David, acting as the judge, cites the law of Moses, specifically Exodus 22, demanding 4-fold restoration for a stolen sheep.
Right, and whether the original author explicitly engineered this arithmetic, or if it's a profound structural coincidence, readers across centuries have noticed a really chilling correlation here.
Yeah.
David decrees that the thief must pay 4-fold. Over the rest of the narrative, David loses exactly 4 of his children.
It's awful to track, but it's there.
First, the unnamed infant born to Bathsheba dies. Second, his daughter Tamar is brutally raped and functionally lost to the family, living desolate in her brother's house. Third, his firstborn son Amnon is murdered by his own brother. And fourth, Absalom himself is killed in the rebellion.
Fourfold restoration exacted in his own blood.
Yes.
It's an absolute devastating metric. And Nathan's prophetic charge against David is fundamentally covenantal. He says, "Why have you despised the word of the Lord?" He lists everything God gave David: the kingship, deliverance from Saul, the house of Israel.
The implication being, if it had been too little, I would have given you more. But you took what was not yours.
Exactly. This is the Deuteronomistic theology of divine retribution laid bare. Actions have absolute, inescapable consequences.
But we have to be careful not to flatten this out into a simple karma mechanism.
Right, because the text doesn't do that.
No, it doesn't. David does something here his predecessor Saul never did. When confronted with his undeniable guilt, David doesn't make excuses.
He doesn't blame anyone else?
He doesn't blame Bathsheba. He doesn't blame the pressures of state. He simply says, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan responds instantly, the Lord has also put away your sin. You shall not die.
Which completely subverts the strict calculus of retribution.
Exactly. The consequences will still tear his family apart, absolutely, but the man himself is spared divine execution. The covenantal relationship is not severed.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because this leads directly to a vital Latter-day Saint theological engagement with this text. We have a specific canonized revelation that comments directly on this moment and David's ultimate legacy.
In Doctrine and Covenants, section 132.
Yes, verse 39. Joseph Smith addresses David's polygamy and his sin. The text states that David's wives and concubines were given to him by the Lord through Nathan, and that David did not sin in those things, quote, save in the case of Uriah and his wife.
Right.
But then it adds a severe eternal judgment. Because of the murder, David hath fallen from his exaltation, and he shall not inherit them out of the world.
That is a massive theological claim that operates on multiple levels.
It really is.
First, within the context of D&C 132, it explicitly distinguishes between plural marriage, which the Revelation frames as divinely sanctioned within that ancient patriarchal context, and the specific horrific sins of adultery and murder, which are absolute covenant breakers. Second, it makes a definitive statement about David's eternal standing that goes far beyond what the Hebrew Bible itself claims. The biblical text says his sin is put away so he won't die physically or be removed from the throne. But Joseph Smith is producing new theology that addresses his eternal progression.
And the analogy I find helpful here is the idea of a constitutional office.
Okay, tell me more.
Think of the office of the presidency. The office, the authority, and the institution survive even if the individual president commits a crime and is impeached.
Ah, I see.
In LDS theology, David falls from his individual eternal exaltation because of his crimes. He loses his personal privileges. But the institution of the Davidic covenant, the promise made in 2 Samuel 7 that a king will reign on his throne forever, that continues uninterrupted. The covenant survives the failure of the covenant holder.
That's a great way to think about it, but, that creates an immense narratological and theological headache for the historians compiling this book.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is really the core of the theological problem of David's legacy. How do you hold up David as the idealized paradigm of kingship, the ultimate covenant king, while simultaneously documenting his moral collapse and the resulting civil war?
It feels incredibly contradictory. I mean, you have the flawless hero of 1 Samuel who slays Goliath and refuses to touch the Lord's anointed. And then you have the broken, compromised politician of 2 Samuel.
Right.
If I am an ancient Israelite reading this, how do I reconcile a God who demands strict obedience but also lets David's dynasty survive this level of corruption?
Well, to understand how these two ideas coexist, we have to look at John Levinson's seminal work, Sinai and Zion.
Oh, this is so good.
Levinson argues that there are two distinct, almost competing theological systems operating simultaneously in the Hebrew Bible. The first is Sinai theology. This is the covenant made with Moses at the mountain. It is strictly conditional.
Meaning, if you obey the commandments, you are blessed. If you disobey, you are cursed.
Exactly. It is an if-then contract.
Okay, so Nathan is operating heavily in Sinai theology when he says the sword will never depart from David's house. He broke the law, he gets the curse.
Exactly. But the second system is Zion theology, which is rooted in God's eternal promise to David in 2 Samuel 7.
The unconditional promise.
Yes. Zion theology is structurally unconditional. God has chosen the house of David, and God has chosen the city of Jerusalem, and that election is irrevocable. Even if the human king fails, the dynasty itself will not be abandoned by God.
So in chapter 12, we are seeing these two massive tectonic plates crashing into each other. Nathan pronounces the Sinai curse, the violence in the family, but he also pronounces the Zion grace. The Lord has put away your sin. You will not die. The throne survives.
And we can actually trace this tension playing out in the editorial history of the book itself.
Let's talk about Richard Elliott Friedman's work here.
Yeah, his work on redaction criticism is highly relevant here. Friedman posits that there were two major editions of the Deuteronomistic History. The first edition was compiled before the exile, during the reign of King Josiah in the late 7th century BCE. For these pre-exilic editors, they are looking backward. They view Josiah as the ultimate historical fulfillment of the Davidic ideal.
The righteous king who finally obeys the Sinai covenant while sitting securely on the Zion throne.
Exactly. But then history intervenes.
Babylon happens.
Babylon happens, Jerusalem burns, the temple is destroyed, the Davidic king is blinded and dragged off in chains to Babylon. So the second edition, the exilic edition, has to grapple with an absolute theological nightmare.
Because the unconditional Zion covenant looks like it has failed completely.
Precisely. So the exilic editors reframe the narrative. They look forward. They realize that if God's promise in 2 Samuel 7 is unbreakable, but the current historical reality is a destroyed throne, then the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant must be eschatological.
It has to point to the future.
It must be pointing to a future ultimate king. The failures of the historical David and his descendants become theological proof that mere human kings will always fall short, and that Israel must wait for an anointed one, a Messiah, who will perfectly fuse Sinai obedience with Zion authority.
And this exilic hope is exactly the trajectory that the New Testament writers pick up. When Matthew opens his gospel, his very first sentence is, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David.
Right.
Jesus is presented as the ultimate fulfillment of that 2 Samuel 7 promise. And what fascinates me is that Matthew doesn't hide David's sins to make that claim.
No, he highlights them.
In fact, in the genealogy, Matthew deliberately includes Bathsheba, referring to her pointedly as her that had been the wife of Uriah. The trauma, the sin, the brokenness, it's all woven right into the messianic bloodline.
It demonstrates that the plan of salvation subsumes human failure. God can work his redemptive purposes through deeply flawed histories. And we see this exact same tension carried over into the Book of Mormon. The Nephite prophets are deeply invested in this Davidic legacy, but they engage it in conflicting ways.
Let's talk about that contrast.
On one hand, you have 2 Nephi, where Nephi is copying massive blocks of Isaiah. That Isaianic material is completely saturated in Zion theology, the royal Davidic ideology, the future glory of Jerusalem, the messianic branch growing out of the root of Jesse.
But on the other hand, you have Nephi's younger brother, Jacob. In Jacob chapter 2, he is dealing with Nephite men who are trying to justify their own sexual sins and plural marriages by pointing to the biblical record of David and Solomon.
And Jacob rebukes them blisteringly.
He says, David and Solomon truly had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord.
It's a fascinating juxtaposition within a single generation of Nephite prophets. Jacob uses the history of David not as a glorious messianic template, but as an abominable cautionary tale to enforce strict, Sinai-like covenant boundaries regarding chastity.
I love that the Restoration doesn't flatten Scripture into a false, easily harmonized simplicity. It gives us multiple prophets at different times, engaging the exact same biblical histories for different revelatory purposes.
Absolutely.
The Scriptures are allowed to be complex because human history and human sin are complex. Which brings us to the next massive tragedy in the text, Absalom's rebellion.
Oh man, chapters 13 through 18 represent the absolute pinnacle of biblical literary craft. The characterization, the pacing, the irony, it is staggering. And the catalyst for all of it is the character of Absalom.
The introduction of Absalom in chapter 14 is brilliant. The text essentially stops the narrative momentum completely just to describe how incredibly good-looking he is.
It really pauses everything.
In all Israel, there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And then it zeroes in on his hair. It says that at the end of every year, he would cut his hair, and it weighed 200 shekels.
Robert Alter's analysis here is crucial. He notes that the biblical narrator constantly plays with the theme of appearances versus realities, a theme we saw way back in 1 Samuel when God chose David over his taller, more handsome brothers.
Right.
Absalom looks like the perfect king. He is physically flawless, he is charismatic, he possesses an innate political brilliance. He sits at the city gates, intercepting people coming to the king for judgment, shaking hands, kissing them, and telling them, "Your claims are good and right, but there is no man deputed by the king to hear you. If only I were judge in the land, I would give you justice."
The text says he systematically stole the hearts of the men of Israel.
He ran a grassroots campaign.
But wait, let's go back to the hair. The 200 shekels of hair, it's not just a vanity detail, is it? It's a loaded gun.
Oh, completely.
The narrator is putting a giant neon sign over his head saying, this exact feature will kill him. It's a masterpiece of perspective irony. We know how Absalom dies. He dies hanging suspended between heaven and earth, caught in the thick branches of a great oak tree by his magnificent hair.
The very symbol of his perfection literally becomes the instrument of his execution.
It is brilliant writing. But we also have to recognize that the text refuses to romanticize his political cause, while simultaneously refusing to make him a one-dimensional villain.
He's incredibly complex.
Absalom is driven by a profound, legitimate grievance. His sister Tamar was raped by the crown prince, Amnon. David, mirroring his own moral paralysis from the Bathsheba incident, was furious, but did absolutely nothing to punish his firstborn son.
David just sat on his hands.
So Absalom takes justice into his own hands, and he possesses a terrifying political patience. He waits 2 full years before exacting revenge and having Amnon murdered at a sheep-shearing festival.
2 years.
Then, after being exiled and returning, he waits another 4 years in Jerusalem, slowly building his conspiracy at the city gates.
He takes a legitimate grievance, the failure of the king to protect the vulnerable, and allows it to morph into disproportionate instrumentalized violence. And when he finally springs the trap, going to Hebron and declaring himself king, David is caught completely off guard. The speed of the collapse is stunning. David's flight from Jerusalem is, to me, the most emotionally complex sequence in the history of the monarchy.
David doesn't even mount a defense. He immediately abandons the capital, likely fearing a protracted siege that would destroy the city.
Which is very pragmatic.
And the image the text gives us is haunting. The great conqueror, the man who subdued the Philistines and the Arameans, walking up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, barefoot, his head covered, weeping as he goes, surrounded by his foreign mercenaries.
And on the road out of the city, they encounter a man named Shimei, who is from the family of the previous king, Saul.
Right.
Shimei runs along the ridge above them, throwing rocks at David, kicking up dirt, and cursing him. Out, out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul.
And David's elite soldiers, specifically Abishai, asked for permission to just go take Shimei's head off. It would take 10 seconds.
But David's response is profound. He says, let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to.
This is a fundamentally different David than the triumphant warrior of chapter 8. This is a man who has fully internalized Nathan's oracle of judgment.
Yes.
He looks at this humiliating moment with rocks bouncing off his guards' shields and recognizes that, in a cosmic sense, he deserves it. He accepts the suffering as a consequence of his own blood guilt. He says, essentially, my own son seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjamite leave him alone? It may be that the Lord will look on my wrong and return good to me for his cursing this day.
But, and this is why I love the psychological realism of this text, David is a penitent saint, but he is still a shrewd, calculating political operator.
Oh, he's always working the angles.
Exactly. He is weeping, but he is working the angles. When the priests Zadok and Abiathar bring the Ark of the Covenant out of the city to accompany him into exile, David stops them. He sends the Ark back to Jerusalem.
It is a brilliant dual-purpose move.
Tell me how you read it.
Theologically, he is submitting to God's will. If God favors me, he will bring me back to see the Ark. If not, let God do what seems good. But politically, he is anchoring the religious center of the nation back in the capital, preventing Absalom from claiming total spiritual authority.
It's so smart.
And even more shrewdly, he tells the priests to act as a covert intelligence network. He sends his loyal counselor Hushai back into the city with explicit orders to infiltrate Absalom's inner circle, flatter him, and act as a spy to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel.
Which leads us to the great council scene in chapter 17.
Right.
Absalom holds a war council. He has Ahithophel, who was previously David's most brilliant advisor. The text says that Ahithophel's advice was regarded as though one inquired of the oracle of God.
He's the best there is.
Ahithophel gives Absalom the tactically perfect advice. Give me 12,000 men, let me strike tonight while David is weary and disorganized.
Right.
I will kill only the king, and the whole nation will fall into your lap without a civil war.
It is cold, precise, and it would have worked perfectly.
Yeah.
But Absalom decides to call in Hushai, David's spy, to get second opinion.
The fatal mistake.
Huge mistake. Hushai knows he has to buy David time to cross the Jordan River and regroup. So Hushai appeals directly to Absalom's colossal vanity. He paints a terrifying picture of David and his men, comparing them to a bear robbed of her cubs in the field.
It's very dramatic.
He says, "Don't go tonight. David is a man of war. He's hiding. If you attack and take early losses, panic will spread. Instead, wait. Gather a massive army from all over Israel, from Dan to Beersheba like the sand by the sea, and you, Absalom, march out in person at their head."
It's terrible military strategy. It surrenders the element of surprise and gives David time to organize. But it sounds so grand, so heroic that Absalom buys it. He wants to be seen leading the massive host.
And the narrator intrudes right here with a direct theological statement.
Yes, this is crucial.
The text says, "For the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom." I find this fascinating. God doesn't intervene with a lightning bolt. He doesn't part a sea. God works his will through the natural psychological flaw of Absalom's own ego.
And Ahithophel understands immediately what this means. He is a pure political pragmatist. When he sees that his advice is ignored in favor of Hushai's flattery, he knows the rebellion is doomed.
He does the math.
He does the math. He knows David will win the protracted war,
Right.
and he knows David will execute him for treason. So he saddles his donkey, goes home to his city, sets his house in order, and hangs himself. It is a chilling, entirely unmoralized note of political realism. He calculated the odds and took his own exit.
Which brings the armies to the forest of Ephraim. Absalom's massive, unwieldy conscript army goes up against David's battle-hardened veterans led by Joab.
And the terrain is brutal. The text says the forest devoured more people that day than the sword.
And then we get the culmination of the hare metaphor.
Yeah.
Absalom is riding his mule. He goes under the thick branches of a great oak. His head catches fast, the mule keeps going, and he is left hanging. One of Joab's unnamed soldiers sees him and reports it to Joab. Joab demands to know why the soldier didn't kill him on the spot.
And the soldier's response is an incredible moment of bureaucratic defiance. He says, "Even if I felt the weight of 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not put out my hand against the king's son."
Because David had explicitly commanded all his generals in the hearing of the troops, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom."
But Joab doesn't care. Joab is the ruthless pragmatist who cleans up David's messes. He takes 3 darts in his hand, rides to the oak tree, and drives them into Absalom's chest while he is still alive. His armor-bearers finish the job. The rebellion is over.
This moves us into our discussion on grief and authorship, because Joab is David's perpetual shadow throughout this entire history.
He really is. He does the brutal, dirty work of statecraft that David's conscience or public image won't allow him to do. He murdered Abner, he murdered Uriah, now he murders Absalom. He makes himself politically indispensable, but personally abhorrent to the king.
And the aftermath of the battle is devastating. 2 runners are dispatched to bring the news of the victory to David, who is waiting anxiously at the city gates. The first runner, Ahimaaz, arrives, and David has only one question.
He doesn't ask, "Did we win?" He doesn't ask, "Is the capital secure?"
Right, he asks, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?"
Ahimaaz loses his nerve and hedges the answer, but the second runner, a Cushite mercenary, arrives. David asks again, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite delivers the truth without flinching, using standard diplomatic phrasing. "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man."
And the dam breaks. David goes up to the chamber over the gate, and he weeps. And the Hebrew text here is just devastating in its repetitive, raw agony. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son."
8 repetitions of "my son" or Absalom collapsing into a puddle of grief. It is one of the most piercing expressions of parental loss ever recorded.
But the political reality of an ancient monarchy cannot wait for his grief.
No, the state has to function.
The army comes back to the city, not like a victorious host, but stealing in like people ashamed of fleeing in battle because the king is weeping for his enemy. Joab marches into David's chamber and delivers a shockingly harsh but entirely necessary political rebuke.
It's an intense scene.
He says, essentially, "You have shamed the faces of the soldiers who just saved your life. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. If Absalom were alive and we were all dead, you would be pleased. Get up, go out, and speak kindly to your servants, or I swear by the Lord not a man will stay with you tonight."
It is the violent, necessary suppression of private grief for public necessity. Joab forces the father back into the role of the king.
And this raises that profound question about authorship we touched on earlier. If Leonard Ross is right, and this document is just propaganda to justify Solomon taking the throne, Why does it spend so much emotional weight making us sympathize with David's love for a rebel son?
Exactly. Why show the king this broken, this paralyzed by grief? Why show him being bullied by his own general?
Right. If I'm writing a press release for the new regime, I don't write this. I don't show the founder of the dynasty as weak or compromised.
No, you don't. This is where A.A. Anderson's theory gains a lot of traction. Anderson suggests this isn't pure propaganda, and it isn't pure subversive critique. It is a highly sophisticated, historically grounded treatment written by a court insider.
Someone who was there.
Someone who lived through the crisis, who understood the brutal dynamics of power, and who refused to simplify the human reality of these figures.
When you contrast this with standard ancient Near Eastern royal literature, the candor is staggering. If you look at Egyptian victory stelae or Assyrian palace reliefs, the king is essentially a god.
He is 10 feet tall, he never makes a mistake, he never loses a battle.
He never weeps, he only smites his enemies in perfect victory. But the biblical text gives us a king who commits adultery, murders his friend, loses control of his family, gets chased out of his capital by his own kid, and collapses in weeping over his treasonous son. Why tell the truth? Why preserve this deeply embarrassing history for the nation?
Because of the theological necessity of failure, the Deuteronomistic historian needed an honest portrait of David because David becomes the benchmark by which every subsequent king of Judah is judged.
Right.
If you sanitize David and make him perfect, you create an impossible standard. You create a covenant based entirely on perfect works, which no future king can meet. But by showing a broken, deeply flawed David who falls spectacularly but still relies on God's promises and repents, you create a covenant of grace.
That connects so deeply to the Latter-day Saint concept of the new and everlasting covenant. The covenant is unconditional in its ultimate scope. God will save his people, the promises to the fathers will be fulfilled, but it is highly personal and conditional in its behavioral requirements for the individual.
Right. You can lose your place in it.
Exactly, as David did regarding his exaltation, but the grace of the covenant framework remains intact to evaluate and ultimately redeem the human family.
Let's turn to the final chapters of 2 Samuel, the closing appendices in chapters 21 through 24. Because after the rebellion is suppressed, the book doesn't end with a neat narrative bow. These chapters feel like a collection of leftover materials.
They're essentially appendices, but they aren't thrown together randomly. They are arranged in a very deliberate chiastic structure, a literary pattern where elements mirror each other, working inward to a center point. It's a structure very familiar to readers of the Hebrew Bible and the Book of Mormon.
Yes. The outer A sections are two narratives of national crisis: the Gibeonite famine in chapter 21 and the devastating census plague in chapter 24. Moving inward, the B sections are two lists celebrating David's mighty men and military heroes. And at the very center of the chiasm, the C section, are two poetic texts: David's Song of Deliverance in chapter 22, which is almost identical to Psalm 18, and the last words of David in chapter 23.
I want to focus on that final crisis narrative in chapter 24, because the story of the census is one of the most theologically troubling passages in the entire Deuteronomistic history.
It really is.
David orders Joab to number the people of Israel and Judah, a census. Now, on its face, a government taking a census seems like standard administrative procedure. We do it every 10 years. But the text frames it as a catastrophic sin.
And it is explicitly problematic because of how the instigation is described. 2 Samuel 24 begins, "The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, 'Go number Israel and Judah.'"
So God is angry at Israel, God moves David to take the census, and then God violently punishes David and Israel for taking the census. It feels incredibly capricious.
It does.
Hold on, that feels incredibly contradictory and frankly unfair. God is already mad at Israel, so he uses David as a pawn to commit a sin, just so he has an excuse to punish Israel with a plague. How did ancient readers reconcile a God that operates like that?
That exact discomfort is why, when the chronicler retells this exact same story hundreds of years later in 1 Chronicles 21, he changes the theology completely. Chronicle says, "Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel." The later writers swapped out the Lord for Satan to solve the theological discomfort and protect God's justice.
But regardless of who incited it, why was the census a sin in the first place? I mean, Moses took censuses in the wilderness.
Scholars debate this, and there are three primary explanations. First, in the ancient Near East, taking a census was often viewed as a presumptuous enumeration of God's resources.
Like counting your wealth.
Yes, you are numbering the army to rely on human strength rather than divine protection. You are claiming ownership over people who belong to Yahweh. It's an act of royal hubris.
What's the second explanation?
The legal argument. In Exodus 30, the law of Moses states that if you take a census, every person numbered must pay a half-shekel atonement money to the sanctuary as a ransom for their life to avoid a plague breaking out among them.
And David didn't do that.
There is no mention in 2 Samuel of David collecting the atonement money, so the legal consequence of plague is automatically triggered.
And the third?
The third is literary and theological. Some scholars argue the text intentionally leaves the causality ambiguous to force us to sit with the terrifying, inscrutable nature of divine sovereignty intersecting with human hubris. Sometimes ancient writers saw God as the ultimate cause of everything, even human folly, and they didn't try to neatly untangle human agency from divine will.
Whatever the cause, the result is horrific. A plague sweeps through the land and 70,000 people die. The narrative culminates in a terrifying apocalyptic image. David looks up and he sees the angel of the Lord standing between earth and heaven with his sword drawn and outstretched over the city of Jerusalem, ready to destroy it.
And here, finally, David steps fully into the role of the true intercessory shepherd king. He doesn't blame anyone else. He doesn't make excuses. He cries out to God and says, "Behold, I am the one who has sinned and done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray you, be against me and against my father's house." He throws his own body between his people and the sword of judgment.
The prophet Gad tells David to go up and build an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David goes up, insists on paying full price for the land and the oxen because he refuses to offer God a sacrifice that cost him nothing.
A true sacrifice.
He builds the altar, he offers the sacrifices, and the text says, "The Lord answered prayer for the land, and the plague was averted from Israel." And we have to make sure we catch the significance of this location. This exact site, the threshing floor of Araunah, becomes the very foundation where David's son Solomon will build the great temple.
It is a masterful piece of compositional theology. 2 Samuel ends not with a victory parade, not with a king on a throne, but with a king on his knees offering sacrifice on a threshing floor. The temple will be built on the exact spot where the sword of divine judgment was sheathed. Holiness is literally constructed on the site where suffering was halted by mercy.
We have spent this entire deep dive operating in the realm of critical scholarship, narratology, and historical analysis. And that is vital for understanding the text. But I want to explicitly acknowledge a shift here, moving from our scholarly inquiry to a more faithful, reflective mode. For Latter-day Saints, 2 Samuel is not just a fascinating artifact of ancient Near Eastern literature, it is scripture. So I'll shift it to a warmer, more personal mode and reflect on this week's Come Follow Me lesson.
I think that's a perfect transition. The lesson this week is titled, Hear Thou in Heaven Their Prayer. Now, technically, that title points forward to Solomon's dedicatory prayer for the temple in 1 Kings 8.
Right.
But the core themes of that lesson, the danger of temptation, and the profound reality that God hears the prayers of those who return to him, are rooted entirely in the soil of David's trauma in 2 Samuel.
Let's reflect on that first theme, the danger of temptation, even for the most favored. I think one of the most frightening things about 2 Samuel 11 is that it refuses to give us an out. It refuses to offer a pre-existing character flaw as an excuse for David.
We can't just say he was a bad seed.
Exactly. We want to say, well, he was always secretly a monster. But the text won't let us. He was a man of immense faith. He wrote psalms of profound devotion. He loved the Lord, and yet he fell. It completely destroys the self-flattering illusion that if we are righteous enough, or if we get old enough, we somehow age out of the capacity to make catastrophic mistakes.
The Apostle Paul understood this perfectly. In 1 Corinthians 10, when discussing the ancient Israelites, he issues a stark warning. "Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." David thought he was standing securely on the roof of his cedar palace, master of the world. And within an hour, the foundation of his entire life fractured. In the LDS tradition, temple covenants frame this exact reality. The covenants are sweeping and eternal, but they are predicated on conditions of continued faithfulness. Even the most highly favored, the anointed kings and queens, can lose their privileges if they abandon the guardrails of the covenant.
But then we have to pivot to the second theme, which is the heart of the gospel. God hears returning prayers, "Hear thou in heaven." When Nathan confronted David, David confessed. And Nathan immediately said, "The Lord has put away your sin."
The grace is immediate.
Now, we spent a lot of time today talking about the consequences. The consequences remained. The baby died. The family violently tore itself apart. The kingdom fractured. But the sin was put away. The relationship between David and God was not permanently terminated.
That is such a humanly necessary doctrine, because if the gospel only works for people who never fail, it works for no one. Catastrophic failure is not the final word. The consequences are terrifyingly real, which prevents us from treating sin casually. But David survives his own ruin. He goes on. He fasts and prays for his dying child. He weeps for Absalom. He intercedes for his people at the threshing floor. He remains a broken, incredibly complicated man who is still, somehow, oriented toward God.
If you read Psalm 51, which tradition links directly to David's confession after Nathan's parable, you hear the voice of a man who knows exactly what he broke. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me.
It's so raw.
You only pray like that when you realize you have done something that justifies being cast away. He is asking for a restoration he knows he hasn't earned.
And for Latter-day Saints, the mechanism that makes that restoration possible is the atonement of Jesus Christ. Christ is the ultimate fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. He is the one who steps into the breach to make the clean heart possible. The trajectory from 2 Samuel 7 through the failures of the kings down to Matthew 1 is all pointing toward the Savior who can absorb the consequences of the fall and offer grace to the broken.
Which brings us right back to the temple. Solomon is going to build the temple on Araunah's threshing floor. Solomon knows his people are going to fail. He knows they're going to sin, get carried away captive, and suffer. So he prays when they fail and when they turn their faces back toward this house and pray, hear thou in heaven their prayer and forgive.
The physical house of God is built precisely on the site where mercy stopped the sword.
It is the ultimate monument to the fact that God's grace outlasts human failure. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. 2 Samuel doesn't resolve cleanly. The consequences of our actions echo through time, tearing through generations. But the covenant still holds. The line continues.
That's right.
As you prepare to transition next week into 1 Kings, into the reign of Solomon and the building of that magnificent structure, keep that hairline fracture in mind. Consider how the temple itself stands not as a monument to human perfection, but as a sanctuary built on the very bedrock of repentance, a testament to a mercy that holds the fractured foundation together. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We will see you next time as we cross over into the Book of Kings.